My name is Rich Filippi, and today's topic is the Israel-Hamas war. So what I want to start with is this. It is a complicated subject. We will not solve it this morning. Okay. But I also want to take the U.S. position. So here is the U.S. State Department's policy goals. This is somewhat altruistic, but it will help to frame some of the conversation. So national security, U.S. interests protecting our citizens, economic growth, access to global markets and free trade, world peace, peace is good for economies, democracy, advocating and protecting its growth globally, human rights, promoting, protecting, and advocating human rights globally. All filtered through U.S. national interest. So that's going to be a little bit of a temper. Next slide. Okay, let's talk about the background first on the Israel-Hamas conflict. Zionism is a concept that was created in the latter part of the 19th century in Europe. It was a response to a tradition of treating the Jews and the Jewish communities as scapegoats whenever things would happen. The plague, poor domestic policies, famine. So it was the Jews that were blamed, and they were treated very poorly throughout Europe and for most of the world. So the goal of Zionism, the idea of Zionism, is to create a homeland for Jews free of pogroms. Pogroms is an East European term, but it basically means what I just said, and that is blaming the Jews for things and pushing them out of their adopted countries and taking their stuff. Okay, so fast forward, World War I, there's the foreign minister Balfour declared in a statement that the Jews deserve a homeland to solicit Jewish financial support for the Allies during World War I. Okay, didn't really happen. World War II, after World War II, we had this mass of survivors from the Holocaust that were displaced, and we needed a place to put them. 1940, I have slides on all this, so we'll get into a little more detail on the background. 1948, the UN declares partitioning of then the British Mandate of Palestine. I've got some graphics. 1948, 1949, Israel and their War of Independence, and that was followed by now we have the 8th Arab-Israeli War. Next. Okay, so the British Mandate in Palestine, this gives you a geographic outline. So after World War I, the Ottoman Empire was dissolved, and the Allies divided up the spoils, and Britain was responsible for Palestine and Transjordan. Mandates were simply, we have governorship over this area until they can govern themselves, and then eventually we'll step away from that. Okay, so past occupiers over this dirt, Egypt, Roman, Crusaders, Ottoman Empire. It's been just a pass-through of lots of invading armies. And then, of course, post-World War I, the British Mandate, and then post-World War II, the division of Palestine into both Israeli and Arab Palestinian areas. And you can see the dark areas are homeland for the Jews, as mandated by the UN, and then the white areas are concentrations of Arab Palestinians, Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Next slide. Okay, so all the surrounding Arab countries, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt in 1948 decided to invade Palestine and eliminate the European Jewish population. Okay, so there was a war of liberation. The Jews living in Palestine agreed to the UN partition of that area. But the surrounding Arab countries said, no, we want to keep it Muslim, and they attacked Israel in 1948. Between 48 and 49, there was the War of Independence. Post-War of Independence, because of the conflict, a lot of Arab Palestinians were displaced from their traditional homeland. Okay? So that was followed by a series of other wars. 56, the Suez Crisis. 67, Six-Day War. 73, Yom Kippur, 50th anniversary in October. 1982, Lebanon War. There was a second Lebanon War. Lebanon is up here, Golan Heights. And then October, the Gaza Israeli Hamas war. Okay, so here are some enclaves that were occupied as a result of Jewish or Israeli victories after some of these wars. These enclaves in the darker color, Gaza Strip, West Bank, and the Golan Heights. In every case, Israel gave them back with some degree of semi-autonomy. Okay. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, what has U.S. policy been throughout this whole thing? In 47, the UN created a partition idea for the state of Palestine. In 1948, Arab-Israeli War in the state of Israel was created. The U.S. acknowledged the state of Israel, the existence of the state of Israel, but not at the expense of other Middle Eastern relations. It's very important for us to maintain those other Middle Eastern relations for economic and political reasons. 1956, the Suez Crisis. The Israelis joined the British and the French in occupying the Suez, and we did not support that. So there were times when we did not support what Israel was doing. Just understand that. It's not a blank check.
Who was the president then?
I don't remember. Hang on. I don't remember. I think it might have been Eisenhower. Yes. Okay. U.S. as a neutral intermediary. That's our goal, is to be a neutral intermediary between the Arabs and the Israelis. That's our goal. There's an ebb and flow of a two-state solution. There was when the UN drew this up in 48, they came up with a two-state solution, but war and vendettas and personal prejudices ended up having now 8 wars. So we'll probably field another two-state solution. I don't know if that'll occur. Recently, not as recent, but Camp David Accords, that's where Egypt made peace with Israel. The Oslo Accords, which allowed for some degree of autonomy in the occupied areas of Gaza Strip and West Bank. West Bank is West Bank of Jordan, right up against Eastern Jerusalem. And we had some more map graphics in a moment. And then October, the U.S. says we have your back until, because, U.S. politics is somewhat fickle. Next. Okay, so who is Hamas? So everybody remember, you're all old enough to remember the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization. Well, yes, some were not born then. Sorry. So the PLO was the main voice of the Palestinian Arabs for a number of years. They used various means to exercise that voice, to include committing acts of terrorism. Okay. In 1993, we talked about the Oslo Accords very briefly. The Oslo Accords created these semi-autonomous enclaves, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and then the Golan Heights were returned back to, they were demilitarized and then returned back to Lebanon. In 2018, the PLO rejected the Oslo Accords. The Al-Fatah party dominates the PLO. The PLO is the political and military representation. Today, it's called the Palestinian Authority. You may have heard that word thrown around. The Palestinian Authority is the governing organization for, supposedly it was for the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Well, Hamas, an organization that came up in 2006, 2007, said, look, the PLO and the Palestinian Authority don't represent the Palestinian Arabs in the Gaza Strip. So if you vote for us, we will ensure greater autonomy and greater civil governance. So that was 2006, 2007 when Hamas as a political entity was created. They came into power, they had the guns, and they controlled the purse strings of the billions of dollars that flow in of foreign aid every year into the Gaza Strip. Okay. Much more militant and much more Islamist than the PLO. So Palestinian Authority controls the West Bank and Gaza Strip is controlled by Hamas. Core beliefs of Hamas: return of all territory to Arab Palestinians, restitution, somebody's going to pay for it, expulsion of all the Jews and the Zionists from Israel, and the right to form their own state. That core belief has not changed. Understand. Next. So, the Israel-Hamas war, October 7th, Hamas fighters invaded Israel from Gaza. Over 4,000 rockets were fired in sequence, 1,200 fighters that came in through air, sea, and land attacks. It was one of the most sophisticated operations I've ever seen, initiated by any Arab Palestinians. The day before represented the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. Symbolically, this was important because Yom Kippur was one of the few Arab-Israeli wars in which Israel was caught unawares. Okay. The Yom Kippur War, lots of soldiers were on leave to their families, and Syria and Egypt attacked. They were successful initially, and then eventually the Israelis beat them back. But it was a near-run thing in '73. Okay, Prime Minister Netanyahu declared the massacre of October 7th. We are at war. This is Israel's 9/11. They wanted to equate it to the same thing we went through on 9/11. Over 20 Israeli border villages were occupied, 2,500 casualties, about 1,200 deaths, and over 230, 240 hostages. West Bank and Golan Heights attacks from southern Lebanon by Hezbollah, different organization. Both organizations have a common denominator, and that is they are influenced by Iran. Okay? So Israel has been fighting, in essence, a two-front war, one in Gaza and one on the Golan Heights up in southern Lebanon. So far, there has not been a ground campaign up in the north, but Hezbollah continues to fire rockets into Israeli population centers up in the north. Okay, so what does Israel do? You invade our territory, you massacre a part of our population, you take hostages. You know, you got to ask the question: what the crap was Hamas thinking that Israel would do? So that asks a bigger question: is why did they do it? And we'll address that in just a moment. So we also have a evolving U.S. and global reaction to the events of October 7th, as well as where we are now, almost 50 days later. As I've said at the very beginning, we will not solve the crisis today, but we'll have a dialogue. Next. Okay, so this gives you a map. That little spot on the ground, purple spot on the ground, is the Gaza Strip. So I did a little math on it. It's approximately 141 square miles, about 2.5 million population. Panama, the city of Panama City is about 41 square miles. The city of Panama City is about 41 square miles. So 1/3 the size of the Gaza Strip. We have 36,000 population in the city of Panama City. There's 2.5 million yeah, it's a highly dense area. Yeah, you're absolutely correct. Okay, so Gaza Strip, this is a big display of it. All of these points were attack points, very organized. I'll go into some talking points on that in just a moment. There are barriers, established barriers all along this border. There are 3 transfer points. There's one up here, checkpoint, and then there are 2 down here, which are, this is Egypt. So there are access points for goods going in and out of Gaza. Everything else has got barriers around it. Okay, next. Okay, is this time different? Yes. The way the operation was coordinated, the way that it was executed, I've never seen anything like this in this area. 4,500 rockets fired in sequence, overwhelmed the Iron Dome. That's Israel's anti-air defense system. Rockets and drones continue to be fired. Drones, anybody that's been to my class, drones are a game changer, not just in this conflict, but also in Ukraine. They're cheap, they're disposable, they give you eyes on the ground very quickly, and then you can use them for reconnaissance, targeting. You can actually use them to drop bombs. So very sophisticated and cheap. One of the largest producers of drones is Iran. Depth of planning and operational sophistication just boggled my mind. This is not a bunch of guys crossing, sticks and stones and then crossing into Israel. This was a very sophisticated operation. High level of training, very specialized equipment. I mean, they had bulldozers, they had all kinds of specialized munitions to blow through the barriers into Israel itself. Iran does fund, train, and supply Hamas. It's not exclusive. Actually, your taxpayer dollars also fund Hamas because, again, billions of dollars every year go into the Gaza Strip. Either we funnel it through the UN or we funnel it directly. And if the gatekeeper is Hamas, they decide how it's spent. Okay. Hamas collaborates with Hezbollah. Hezbollah, again, was the large militia organization up in southern Lebanon, and Islamic Jihad. There are a number of smaller organizations in the Gaza Strip. Hamas is the largest. Hard to body count how many members of Hamas there are. Reasonable to say around 30,000, yet only about 1,200 were used in this attack. Where the rest of them? Well, they didn't escape from the Gaza Strip, so they're probably most of them are in the south part of the Gaza Strip right now. Okay, so 24 barriers were breached in coordinated attacks, 240 hostages taken from multiple nations. It was different. Next slide. It was an intelligence failure. Absolutely. How was the buildup missed? It was there. Hamas created model kibbutzes. Yeah, kibbutzes. They created some model mock-ups, life-size model mock-ups in Gaza City, and they used them as training camps. So it was apparent to the Israelis and Israeli intelligence that there was ongoing training, ongoing buildups, but The view and intelligence is a great thing, and you give it to the decision makers. But if the decision makers have an agenda of their own, a lot of times they'll ignore what doesn't apply to their own view of the world. So that is, yes, it was an intelligence failure, but it was absolutely a political failure on Israel, because they did not react and act on this buildup before October, when the attacks occurred. The wall, the barrier surrounding Gaza Strip has physical barriers deep into the ground. It has fencing, wire. It has CCTV, so eyes on the ground. It has active patrols, ground sensors, lots of things. There's also a demilitarized zone in between the actual barrier walls and partially inside of Gaza. There's a reliance on signals intelligence by the Israeli intelligence services. Signals intelligence is you and I talking on a cell phone. That's in the basic form, but it's radio communications, it's all kinds of other things. Hamas understood that. Iran understood that. So guess what? They didn't use talking on the phone to make Israel aware that there was an attack that was going on. I mean, that kind of sounds simple, right? But again, if you have a reliance on signal intelligence or imagery intelligence, you're not really getting into the minds of the opposition. And Hamas used lots of operational security and deception. They made it appear to the Israelis and to the world that they were getting serious about governance of the Gaza Strip and not the militancy and terrorist operations. They made the world and Israel appear that they were interested now in governance, but they never changed their goals and aims, right? And there was a lot of activity in the past 18 months going on in the West Bank, and the West Bank was where Israel was focusing most of its attention. And there's this ongoing normalization of Arab relations with Israel. We had the Abraham Accords under President Trump. Since then, Saudi Arabia, the big player, okay? Saudi Arabia was in discussions about normalization with Israel. Remember, a lot of these countries technically were still at war with Israel from 1948. So normalization means we're accepting the fact that Israel has the right to exist, and now we're going to be trading partners. And I think that was one of the triggering events for the attack. It wasn't the only one. Again, you could use symbolism of the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, a number of other things. You know, if you're an organization that is reliant on keeping the pot stirred, and the world is changing around you, and you're becoming less relevant, then you need to stir the pot even more. And I think that may have been one of the influences of their attack in last month. Okay, and yeah, politics and worldview were changing. Okay, next. Okay, getting a little deeper into deception and subterfuge. A lot of these points, you can read them. A lot of these points I already talked to, that the Hamas projected themselves as being legitimate governors of the Gaza Strip. The use of glider commandos creates confusion because you don't know where, you think, okay, ground attack, we're going to focus on the ground, but then you have airborne attacks and you also have seaborne attacks. So it throws the command and control of the southern part, Israel's southern command, in confusion. They also effectively jam the command and control systems for the southern command, in the Israeli southern command. So they couldn't talk to the people on the ground to find out what was going on. So it disrupted response times. Local Israeli military commanders were targeted. There were a number of Israeli commanders that were killed. We're talking about lieutenant colonels. They overwhelmed the kibbutzes and the border posts. They created mass destruction and murder and mayhem, and they took hostages back to Gaza. Hostages used as leverage, as they are being used right now as leverage. Next. Okay, so what does Israel do? They react. First, they reacted by sealing the border. Well, first they reacted by, once they were able to mobilize and coordinate counterattacks, they were able to catch any of those Hamas militants that were still inside of Israel, control their borders again, seal off the border areas that were breached, and control the airspace using drones. Then they initiated an air campaign to soften up the targets, to destroy Hamas's infrastructure. Unfortunately, when you build an extensive tunnel system underneath apartment complexes, schools, UN facilities, mosques, hospitals, yeah, it's kind of hard to have a bomb go, okay, we're going to hit here, even though they're smart bombs. And so Israel responded with a vengeance. They knew that the clock was ticking. Initially, there was global empathy for what Hamas did. Every hour and every day that's passed since the 7th of October, the world is shifting because they're receiving pictures and interviews about the devastation that's going on in Gaza City. Okay? So Israel knows that there will be a point in time when the world is going to say, enough. So their goals: free hostages, limit civilian losses, and go after Hamas. So Hamas is a civil and a military arm. Okay, they're going after the military arm, but it's kind of hard to distinguish because they don't wear uniforms. And this just shows you an example where their attacks. What they did was they divided Gaza Strip north and south, and they told all populations in the north, there's a wadi, which is like a arroyo if you lived out in the southwest. It's like a dry riverbed, okay? And they said, you need to move to south of that wadi. You need to get out, and you need to move south of that wadi. Okay? Because we're going to systematically go after the militants that are in the northern half of the Gaza Strip. And that's what they've been doing. Okay? And they've also initiated a ground campaign to cut off movement south, control movement south, and then to create a stricken circle. Next. Okay. So why now? I mean, we've already addressed a couple of those points. I think the relevancy of Hamas was starting to fall off. Iran was getting anxious about the normalization of Arab states with Israel. Who's behind the attacks? We can go multiple layers. We can say Hamas did it on their own. Iran did not know. But absolutely, Iran provided a lot of the logistics, the equipment, the training, etc. So they might not have known, plausible deniability. We didn't know they were in attack on the 7th of October. Yeah, but you helped them for the last 2 years prepare for that attack with equipment and training and I would suspect even personnel. Okay. So I got to ask the question, and this is now where I've got a few more slides left, but this is where we can have some interaction. Okay, step back and ask the question. I know we're taking it from a Western view, from a U.S. view, but is Hamas, Hezbollah, and ISIS justified in their violence? We have 5 minutes left. To some, you might, if you put yourself in their shoes, then they might have the justification. They feel disenchantment. I'm not advocating violence. I'm just saying If they can't get their view out, then maybe they use violence to pay it.
Don't you use the word Palestinians here instead of Hamas?
Well, most
To humanize it?
most people in the world, I'll answer your question. Most people in the world are no different than you and I. All they want out of life is some degree of stability and safety, an ability to earn a living, an ability to have a family, an ability to leave a better world for my family. Most people in the world, there are going to be outliers that have a different agenda, but they are by and large in the minority. So when I use Palestinians, I really have to be very distinct with it. 2.5 million in Gaza City, most of them want to live in peace. They want to have a job. They want to raise a family, but you're ruled by a group who is very extremist and rules by the gun and controls the amount of food, water, electricity that goes on where you live. So what do the Palestinians want? Well, just like the Cubans that came over in 1962, you're not going to get the houses back that Castro took over in Cuba in 1962. You're not going to get that. So you have to move on from there. So we apply the same thing. If the Palestinian Arabs say, we want a restoration back to 1948, it's not going to happen. So the best you can hope for is some degree of semi-autonomy in the Palestinian Arab areas. Here's an interesting point. So Israel, 11 million population. Okay? 25% of it is Arab. Is Arab, Palestinian, Muslim, 25%. There are members of the Knesset, their parliament, that represent the Arab voice, the Palestinian voice in Israel. Okay? Obviously, they're not the ones that live in Gaza or the West Bank. Okay? Increase of anti-Jewish demonstrations worldwide and in reaction to that global response. We've seen some shifting of these organizations from empathy, sympathy to it's about the let's liberate Palestine. Well, the Israeli-Hamas war is not about the liberation of Palestine. So these kids at university who are saying let's liberate Palestine, I'm not quite sure they understand the dynamics and how to make a distinction between what happened on the 7th of October and some solution, equitable solution for the Palestinian Arabs. Okay. Next. Possible outcomes. Israel destroys Hamas. Don't think it's going to happen because you can't destroy an idea, right? And then what then? Who rebuilds Gaza? Get your checkbooks out. Okay. Because we're going to directly or indirectly rebuild Gaza Strip. Okay. There's increasing pressure for ceasefire. Hamas survives, victorious and emboldened. It expands to a regional conflict to include surrounding territories, Lebanon, Iran, even some of the Arab states. Don't know. That's still on the table. It's not a done deal that it's going to be contained. At some point, Israel becomes isolated. Might force a domestic change. Might force the political change, and Netanyahu may not be prime minister. In 1973, with the Yom Kippur War, Golda Meir was voted out next election. Okay. Post-war, what's going on? Changing geopolitics. This is something that I want to address very briefly and then open it up for conversation. Next slide. There's an ongoing growth globally, not just domestically, not just in our own little neighborhoods, not in our own state, not in our own country, but globally, there's a growth of what's called neo-tribalism. Post-World War II, the survivors of World War II, I'm not talking about the Jews specifically, I'm talking about those that survived the horrors of World War II, said never again will we have another world war. And there was a rise of what's called multilateralism. Basically, that's coming together in a group and working out solution to each person's issues or each country's issues. So we created a whole series of international laws, international behavior. Some of those organizations, Geneva Convention, United Nations, World Trade Organization, NATO, even Warsaw Pact, the Marshall Plan. So these international organizations were created post-World War II to avoid any large conflict. Questions, please.